And we're going to have our discussion tonight a little bit about wine, whiskey, and beer. It's about spirits, but it is a shir, and there will be words of Torah, and it is actually sponsored by Susan Jerkowitz. And today's the actual yahrzeit of Gene of Yitzchak Elazar ben Mordechai, the 5th of Cheshvan, 11 years ago. 11 years ago. Yeah, 11 years ago. I had the privilege of knowing Gene, so therefore it is meaningful for me to be sharing with you words of Torah in honor and in memory and for the schus of a very, very special neshama. So we thank Susan for the sponsorship, and Kaddish was said in his memory. And I see a few family members also joined, and it's always a schus to remember him. And the way we keep up the memory and the way we do things for our neshama and our tradition is by gathering together. And always with words of Torah, there's nothing better than doing that tonight. So that's what we're going to try to do. I will not go too late because I know everyone wants to know more about Hunter Biden's laptop. So I'm sure that at 9 o'clock, everyone's going to be running to see an aggressive individual with the Farshlof and a fellow together debating. So everyone will be busy with their entertainment. Next week, we will have the opportunity to discuss a little bit about the election south of the border. That's our topic for next Thursday night. But for tonight, we have, perhaps it's a good way to prepare ourselves for this debate by studying words that relate to alcoholic beverages. And my goal is a little bit to share at least some halachic practical statements besides the history and other things we'll be touching upon as well. Thank you, Susan, again. So about 20 something years ago, it was before Purim in Buffalo, New York, and someone walked over to me with a small bottle of grape juice. And as you know, we are careful. We have the opportunity in this generation to enjoy many wonderful things that have hashgachos, that have kosher symbols on them. And I am full of appreciation, and I truly mean it, to these organizations that have made keeping kosher easy, not just for myself, but for all of North American and world Jewry. And the merits of the OU and the other kosher agencies is incredible, that you could travel anywhere in North America and find a whole meal, right, in supermarkets. It's just magnificent. And how beautiful it is that you have mashgichim and great rabbis throughout North America and throughout the world doing their part in placing hashgachos, kosher supervision on products. Something indeed to celebrate. Now, this specific bottle of grape juice had on it more than one hashgacha, more than one kosher agency approving the product, which is common. It is common that you have several kosher agencies, especially when it comes to wines, because you want to be sure that the Ashkenazim are comfortable, the Sephardim are comfortable, the Chassidim are comfortable, that everyone is comfortable with it. I personally sometimes feel that it's better if there's only one kosher supervision, because then they take full responsibility and not four, because each one relies perhaps on the other. But nevertheless, this bottle of wine had two hashgachas, the OU and some Hasidic hashgacha out of New York. Okay? And then he shows me that under the OU symbol, it is stated that this product is mevushal, cooked. Now, this is a relevant piece of information because, as we'll discuss soon, what defines kosher wine is the fact that it was not touched by a non-Jew, We'll discuss the history and why it is so. We know as well that if the product is cooked, it no longer could be affected by the contact or the fact that it came into contact with the non-Jew. So therefore, we seek out, if we are interested in bringing a bottle of wine into an environment where there are non-Jews, for example, a catered event, so we look for yain mevushal, we want it to be cooked. So under the OU, it made it very clear that it is mevushal. And then he turned the bottle, and something I'll never forget, he turns the bottle around, and there was another hashgacha, another kosher agency that supervised it, and under it, it said, lo mevushal, not mevushal. So here you had one bottle. On one side, it said mevushal, and on the other side, it said lo mevushal. Now, due to the fact that it was before Purim, I started laughing. I thought it was a joke, because no one would be as absurd to confuse the consumer that on one side it says mevushal and on this other side it says lo mevushal, right? Can you imagine a product that on one side it says contains peanuts and on the other side it said peanut free? So I thought it was a Purim joke. Unfortunately, it wasn't a Purim joke, but rather there's a disagreement between these two agencies. If indeed it is considered mevushal or not, we'll discuss soon why there is such a disagreement. And both of them decided to put it on the bottle itself to confuse everyone. Fine. So that's a little bit of an introduction to our a brief section that will relate to wine. And it works as follows. Wine is extremely powerful, right? It is really a drink, a beverage that symbolizes this world. We are believers as Torah Jews that the Almighty wants us to enjoy the world, right? Kadosh Baruch Hu wants us. He created this magnificent world with unbelievable products. Many of them and most of them that are really good are natural, right? You could go ahead and purchase during this season fresh apples, and you could go ahead and purchase squash. It's delicious. I've had something very good for dinner tonight that I really feel this is a gift from the Creator. Kadosh Baruch Hu wants us to recognize it is from Him. We make a bracha. We are mindful of the fact that He is the Creator. Mission accomplished. You're a good Jew. Now, of all those items that the Kadosh Baruch Hu created that symbolize pleasure and it should be used in the right way, wine is number one on the list, because we make kiddush with wine. When we want to go ahead and lekadesh, to sanctify the world, Friday night, we sit down with that cup of wine and we make a declaration of faith. We thank God for the beverage. We sanctify the day by elevating the physical, and we elevate it by that very important and significant recognition. Fine? Now, obviously, the world that was given to us can be used in a very good and positive way. Unfortunately, it can become quite destructive. And here again, we can focus on wine. Wine could be misused. When a person sits down and he takes a glass to relate to God, wonderful. When he sits down with a bottle or two to go ahead and destroy the human mind, our essence, and what makes us different than animals, that is a tragedy, right? Noah, we're going to read about it in the Parsha. Noah failed in that area. Use wine appropriately. That's what Judaism teaches. Use the world appropriately. So wine really symbolizes all these physical pleasures. Now, wine became the beverage of the gods, and therefore it was common in pagan cultures 2,000-3,000 years ago that to satisfy the gods, to show that we are willing to give them everything that we have, a libation was done to whatever pagan force you worship. So therefore, there was a serious issue that existed in the Middle East at the time and throughout the world, even here in the Americas, of wine used as a libation to satisfy and to relate to the gods. And it was a significant tool in avodah zarah, in idol worshiping, in idolatry. And as we all know, Judaism has been fighting this avodah Zara for the past 3,500 years. And the Almighty made it very, very clear, keep away that anything that relates to Avodah Zarah. And wine was that crucial issue. And therefore the rabbis tell us you should know wine, even if you do not know for a fact that it was used for a pagan libation, you should make the assumption that if the non-Jew comes in contact with a bottle of wine, or even touches it, or even shakes the open bottle, it is considered as if it was designated for Avodah Zarah, and you are not allowed to drink it, and you are not allowed to even derive benefit from it. This is what the Talmud tells us. Now, when the Talmud makes that decree, at that time, Avodah Zarah is a little bit in a decline, right? 2,000 years ago, the idea of pouring a wine libation to worship a pagan force, that was not as common as it was perhaps 2,500 years ago. But the rabbis strengthened this decree because they noticed another concern. You know, our goal as Jews is to be sure that there's Judaism 100 years from now, right? And so much of the tzedakah and so much of the Torah teaching that we do, and the focus we have on Jewish education, right? Many people in this community have been involved for many, many decades in Jewish education, right? You want to be sure that there are young children that one day are going to have knowledge of what Yiddishkeit is about. Jewish continuity is everything for us. And we know very well that, you know, the world has temptations. And if the young man will interact with the young woman who is not Jewish, there's danger there, right? We all know of stories, you know, that could occur in a college campus, but it could also occur in a bar. So therefore, the rabbis being sensitive to it, they noted the following, that listen, the decree that relates to wine of a non-Jew relates, or another reason to strengthen our prohibition is because it might lead to intermarriage, which is logical. And therefore they linked, or they added another layer to the prohibition due to intermarriage. And as a result of that, in a situation where you have a wine that technically the rabbis are not concerned that it was used for a libation or designated for a pagan libation, they also did not place the prohibition when it comes to intermarriage. And what I mean by that is the following. The rabbis were aware that if you take wine and it is cooked, there is no longer a concern that it's going to be used for a pagan libation. The norm, the rules were, it was understood that you're not going to use cooked wine, which becomes inferior, becomes more concentrated. You're not going to go ahead and use it for a pagan libation. And by the way, in Lahavdil, in our Beis Hamikdash as well, wine that was cooked would not be used for a wine libation. And since the rabbis linked the prohibition of wine that relates to a concern of intermarriage to the pagan concern, so therefore the decree upon wine does not apply to wine that has been cooked, mevushal. And therefore in this day and age, where we still do not drink non-kosher wine, if it would be a wine that would not be poured as a libation, no issue. It has to be mevushal. But now there is a disagreement. There is a disagreement. We'll get you, Josh. There is a disagreement. What exactly defines mevushal? How cooked does it have to be cooked, right? What degree does it have to reach? So there's a major disagreement between poskim. And 20th century poskim have two different approaches. In the land of Israel, like Reb Shlomo Zalman Auerbach and Reb Elyashiv, they were of the opinion, so I've quoted two great 20th century rabbis from Israel. They believed that to consider it cooked, it has to be to such an extent that a little bit of the water within the wine evaporated. And when you have a beverage and some of the water evaporates, it becomes a little bit thicker. that thickness makes it inferior, and that is what is going to remove the prohibition of non-kosher wine. So that happens to be a very high level of cooking. It has to reach 212, maybe 190, but most probably 212 degrees. It has to reach a boiling point. And that is actually the school of some rabbis in Israel. And that is the school of some of the hashgachos. And therefore, when it comes to a bottle of wine that was pasteurized, and it was pasteurized at perhaps 168 or maybe 178, but not more than that, they would argue that such wine is not mevushal. And if such a bottle of wine was opened and poured by someone at home, help who is not Jewish, you have a problem, according to those authorities. Ramoshe Feinstein, on the other hand, disagrees. And he notes that throughout halachic literature, when something is supposed to be cooked, there's a measurement called yad soledet. If it is hot enough that a person would pull back his hand because it will be hurtful to touch it, that is considered cooked. And therefore, he says that if it reaches about a 175, 165, he says different things in different responses. But what he makes it clear is that when wine or grape juice is pasteurized, it is considered mevushal. And therefore, according to Ramoshe, when the OU, right, wants to go ahead and go into a plant, and they are careful that no non-Jews come in contact with it until after pasteurization, such wine is 100% kosher, and it's called mevushal. And that explains why these chachomim placed on one bottle, on one side, under the Hasidic hashgacha out of Brooklyn, most probably they wrote not mevushal, but on the other side, under the OU, it said mevushal. A little bit of an insight, halachically speaking, in North America, we follow Ramoshe Feinstein. And obviously, when a person is going to be hosting, right, or at a wedding where there is a concern that non-Jews are going to come in contact with the wine, it is appropriate to get mevushal. But a mevushal of Ramosha, an OU mevushal, is good enough halachically 100%. That is what we follow. I remember many years ago, here at B'nai Torah, about 7 years ago, we had a class that discussed wine. And I think I did mention that earlier in my career, when I was in Western New York, over 20 years ago, I was in contact with a plant not far from Buffalo, and they were producing Magen David wine. Magen David. You see it less now, but I'm sure some of the old timers, and I'm not saying who's considered an old timer, does remember the Magen David brand that had the triangle K on it. The triangle K is of hashgacha of a very well-respected rabbi, Rabbi Ralbag. But the fact is that he had standards that were a little bit lower. And it was necessary for North America at that time, because sometimes when you lower standards, you make it available for many, which was perhaps something that he felt was needed. But as a recommendation, I would say that due to the fact that we have available kosher wine with good standards of the OU, Magen David is not recommended in general. And the reason is because when they pasteurize, or it's not really a pasteurization, but the cooking of the wine that is done at their facility, and then giving a green light for the non-Jews to come in contact with it, was only about 138 degrees Fahrenheit, meaning it wasn't hot enough to almost all poskim. So I'm not here to question or, God forbid, criticize anyone, but I am here to make a recommendation that when you want to purchase kosher wine, if the Magen David has the triangle K, not that I've seen it recently, it is something that would probably be a better thing not to use, and to turn to the OU. That's just a recommendation that I do make. Our discussion tonight is going to be about several different spirits. So I would like to start off with a story about a rabbi. Okay, I want to start off a story about a rabbi. The name of this rabbi is Rabbi Mordechai Pinchas Teitz, Rabbi Teitz. And some of you who have connections to the United States or to New Jersey know about the great Rabbi Teitz from Elizabeth, New Jersey. And he was a very well-respected rabbi, a very fascinating individual, Rabbi Teitz. Rabbi Teitz was originally, if I'm not mistaken, from Latvia. And as a young man in his late 20s, he was recognized as a scholar. He was charismatic. He was a leader. And at some point in the early 1930s, the Telz Yeshiva was in financial difficulty. And they turned to Rabbi Teitz, young Rabbi Teitz, who was again, maybe 25 years old. And they asked him, can you do us a favor? One of the leaders of the Telz Yeshiva, Rabbi Eli Meir Bloch, is traveling to the United States. Would you be willing to travel with him to encourage people to donate funds to the Telz Yeshiva? And young Rabbi Teitz, young Rabbi Mordechai Pinchas, makes his way with Rabbi Eli Meir Bloch and raises funds in the United States for the Telz Yeshiva in Lita, in Lithuania. At that point, at one Shabbos, he lands up in Elizabeth, New Jersey, and there was a rabbi there. I think Rabbi Perlis was his name, and they're there by the Shabbos table, and Rabbi Perlis, the local rabbi, was impressed with the young man, very impressed with the young man, and he had a daughter at the Shabbos table. And they dated, they got married, and Rabbi Teitz remained not just in the United States, but remained in Elizabeth. And unfortunately, the Rabbi Perlis passed away, and young Rabbi Teitz became the rabbi in Elizabeth. Elizabeth at the time did not have a minyan of Shomrei Shabbos Jews, but it was a community with many, many, many Jewish people. This was America of the 1930s. And Rabbi Teitz had a vision. He was a visionary, and he understood that if you want Jewish continuity, you got to make changes. And it has to start off with education. It has to start off with schools, high schools, teaching young women on a very high level. And he established in Elizabeth school after school after school. He was a person that his concern was not just for his local community, but he had concern for world Jewry. From the 1960s on, he made dozens of trips to Russia, to the Soviet Union. And this was something, as we all know, I mean, Avi could tell you, right? Avi Citron was there at some point, I think in the 1980s, early 1980s, that it wasn't a fun place to go, to the Soviet Union, right? There was a level of danger there. Avi and Simi were there. But Rabbi Teitz made it. His concern for Klal Yisrael was great. Now, due to the fact that he was a visionary, some of the more conservative rabbis, and I mean conservative with small c, meaning rabbis of the old school, were not happy with some of his activities. So, for example, he was once at a meeting of the Vada Rabbonim in New York, and this is taking place in the late 1930s. And he said to the Rabbonim, I think that we have to start putting Yiddish aside, and we have to start teaching and preaching in English, because we are going to lose the next generation if we don't brush up on our English. And they thought that they're listening here to a goy. What person, what kind of Rav would get up and say that we have to start putting Yiddish aside? And when Rabbi Teitz got back home, he found out that they removed him from the Vada Rabbonim. He was off. That the Vada Rabbonim felt that he is too modern, and that someone like that does not deserve to be a member here. A year later, they realized it was a mistake due to the fact that he was a big Talmid Chacham. They welcomed him back, but he was a visionary. He was a visionary that he was the first rabbi in North America that saw great value with radio waves. And he got in touch with a radio station in New York, WEVDAM 1050. And he said to them, listen, there are many Jews who will listen to you. I would like to give a shir once a week, or I don't remember how often it was, a shir in Gemara. Now, he gave it in Yiddish, actually. And his explanation was that he knows very well of thousands upon thousands of people who came from the old country. And they're busy during the week, right, earning a living. And he felt that he could reignite their Yiddishkeit if they hear a shir in Yiddish. And he gave a shir in Yiddish over the radio waves. And there again, a few of the rabbis were critical of him. They quoted a section of the Talmud that a person should not teach Talmud or Torah teachings in public. But nevertheless, he continued. He continued because he felt responsibility for Jewish continuity and for Torah in North America. That was Rabbi Teitz. Now, as a person who wanted to do more for the Yiddishkeit, there was one area he felt that needs fixing. And therefore, in the late 1940s, after doing some research, he found out that all the blended whiskey that was consumed, as Jews do, in North America, were processed and stored and aged in casks that previously had wine, sherry casks. Wine is not kosher, and we know very well that if you have a vessel that contained for an extended period of time a non-kosher beverage, the flavor is absorbed into the vessel. And in this case, flavor is absorbed into the wood. Eventually, when you store the whiskey for 18 months or longer, it will get a little bit of the flavor of the wine. So he felt that this is simply an issue with kashrut. And he developed, or he came in contact with a few distilleries to begin the process of kosher whiskey. And he's a visionary. So when he was finally able to do so, he needed some support from other rabbis to decree and to declare throughout North America that we should only be using that specific brand. And he turned to Ramosha Feinstein. And he shares with Ramosha how much effort he put into this project and the good news. And he says, and now, Ramosha, I expect you as a big posek to go ahead. And Rabbi Teitz, by the way, was much younger than Ramosha. And he says, I would expect to get you to support a declaration that we should only be using kosher certified whiskey. So Ramosha's response is very, very interesting because he complimented Rabbi Teitz for his hard work. And he said to him, you should know that what you are doing is good. But to declare that the whiskey in North America, the blended whiskeys are problematic, that's where I don't agree. And Ramosha says, listen, I myself at home actually am careful not to drink the whiskey. But when I come to shul and there's a l'chaim, I'm not going to insult someone with astringency and not drink from it. I'll drink from a blended whiskey, no question about it, because it's kosher. So therefore, even though what you're doing is good, let me explain to you why halachically it is not an issue. So this is what Ramosha notes. So let's study a little bit why Ramosha is of the opinion that blended whiskey is not really a concern. So it works as follows. In Talmudic times, people did not drink wine straight. It was always mixed with water. That's what the palate enjoyed, right? It's something for me, it's very hard to relate when I read in the Talmud that the norm was that a glass of wine was 1/4 wine and 3/4 water. I have difficulty thinking of it because I like my wine the way it is. But, different palates, different times, some people, for example, imagine if you only drink espresso and then one time you drink a regular cup of coffee. So you probably feel it's like water, right? So different times, different people, and I have to accept it that that's how it was done in Talmudic times. So the average glass of wine in Talmudic times was 3 or 75% water and 25% wine. The Talmud has a discussion of the following scenario. Listen to this scenario, that a person had in front of him 2 glasses of wine. Okay, now they're already post blending, meaning they already had the water in it. One of them was regular wine. The other one was truma. In other words, one of the other glass came from grapes that were designated for a Kohen, and it was made into wine. Water was added. So here I have in front of me these 2 glasses. And remember, every glass only has 25% wine and 75% water. One of them is regular kosher wine, and one belongs to a Kohen Truma, which I, the non-Kohen, should not be drinking. Someone, for some reason, mixed the 2 together. They mixed the 2 together. So the Talmud tells us that you should know the water that is in this mixture can nullify the wine that is truma. The water nullifies the wine that's truma. In other words, if let's say one glass had 1 ounce of regular wine, 3 ounces of water. The other one had 3 ounces of water and 1 ounce of truma. When you combine the 2, you have 6 ounces of water and you have 1 ounce of truma. It's nullified and anyone could drink it. So we have here a unique law that in general, when it comes to the laws of nullification, we all know that you need shishim, you need 60 times the volume to nullify something. Wine, if it is not an avodah zarah wine, if it's the wine of today, even if it's non-kosher, it seems to be that once it is less than a 1/6 of the beverage, of the mixture, it loses its wine flavor. And we all know that when you water down, if you pour a little bit of wine, it looks like wine, perhaps. It has a redness, but it's no longer the flavor of wine. It's not the flavor of wine, and it is batel b'shesh. Now, the Talmud talks about water. There is a question among authorities, what happens if it is not that the wine is mixed into water, but into another beverage? There is a dispute, and Ramosha Feinstein makes it very clear. Yes, the Talmud mentions water, but the rule applies to all beverages. And therefore, Ramosha notes the following. When you produce your whiskey in a sherry cask, correct, right? The little bit of wine is probably more than a 60th, but it is not more than a 1/6. And therefore, it is batel, it is nullified. And therefore, Ramosha tells us that blended whiskey is considered kosher. This is the leniency of Ramosha Feinstein. After Ramosha wrote this for the past 6 decades, there's been a debate to what extent do we take it into consideration. And some shuls are more strict, believe it or not, and others are less strict. Here in Toronto, we are quite confident that we have a green light that it is okay, because there's a great posek here in Toronto of Shlomo Miller, and he follows Ramosha Feinstein's school independently. He is not one who needs Ramosha to support him for an opinion. He often takes opinions that are different, but Rabbi Miller is also of the opinion that the blended whiskey is not an issue. So compliments were given to the great Rabbi Teitz, and we had the opportunity to study a little bit about Rabbi Teitz, but at the same time, we got ourselves a green light for our blended whiskey. So we so far had a little discussion that relates to wine, a little discussion that relates to whiskey, and now we'll talk a little bit about beer, And by the way, Ontario, there are good beers produced here in Ontario. It's nice to shop local. But we'll have a brief discussion and then a little halachic statement that relates to beer. So the Talmud itself shares with us a story about Rabbi Papa, Rav Papa. Okay, so remember the name. He's the rabbi. He is the rabbi we're going to be studying now for the next couple of minutes. If you have ever been or participated in a siyum, there's actually a tradition to mention 10 children of Rav Papa, right? Chanina bar Papa, Rami bar Papa. So it seems to be he's a very significant rabbinic authority. Rav Papa was a rabbi in a city called Narsh. Narsh. Nun Reish Shin. Narsh. Now, this is relevant information because the city of Narsh had a very bad reputation in Talmudic times. And in one place, Rav Papa got up and he said that you should know, Lo ava Narsh shemo advar Hashem. You should know the people of Narsh never want to listen to the words of Hashem. So the rabbis had an issue with the Narshans for some reason. And another rabbi at a different time, indicating that there was some kind of fundamental problem in Narsh, tells us that you should know. Rabbi Gittel notes, if you ever get kissed, if you ever get a kiss, what that was done in the olden days before COVID, if you ever get a kiss from someone from Narsh, count your teeth. Count your teeth. Okay? Narsha nashkach, they are such ganovim, they are such crooks, that if he kissed you, you better be sure that you still have all your teeth intact. So Narsh is a city, Narsh is a community, the rabbis are very, very critical. So now comes the question, Rav Papa tried to make changes there, obviously, but how did he support his yeshiva? Yeshivas were supported by locals. How did Rav Papa manage to support his yeshiva? So it appears that Rav Papa, and it's something that I am in awe of, when you have a rabbi who teaches Torah to a community, teaches students, but at the same time is able to support himself, is something to be inspired by. Rav Papa had a side business. He had a side business. And the side business of Rav Papa was that he was a beer producer. He produced beer, right? Can you imagine that? You're interviewing Rav Papa, and what do? He says, well, in the mornings and afternoons, I teach Torah, and then in the evenings when I have time, I have a brewery, okay? You don't find that nowadays, but that's what Rav Papa does. And Rav Papa makes it very clear. He shares this information with us with pride. And Rav Papa tells us, if not for my production of beer, lo iatre, I wouldn't have been wealthy. I am wealthy, and I am able to support my students and this rabbinic institution because of my beer production. Okay? Now, it is important to remember that the beer in Talmudic times, the average beer, was not the beer of today, meaning it was not made from grains, not from the barley or the oats, right? Not from grains, but rather it was a date beer. It was a date beer. They would crush the dates. The dates have sugar. Somehow they would pick up some yeast. Not exactly clear how they did it, but they knew how to pick up the yeast. The yeast would convert the sugars into alcohol, and that's how they had their alcoholic beverage. It was a date beer. At some point, obviously, as Jews depart Babylonia and make their way to other regions, especially into Europe, the beer switched from a date beer to a grain beer. So there was a major switch that occurred. And this is very, very relevant halachically because the Talmud tells us that there was actually a decree not to drink beer in a tavern owned by a non-Jew. There was a rabbinic decree of Talmudic times. But the German rabbis of the 11th century tell us that this decree relates specifically to date beer. On the other hand, when it comes to beer that is made of grain, the ones we are accustomed to, the decree does not apply to. So this is just a piece of information that relates. But what you do need to know, is that Rav Papa was a beer producer. Now, keeping that information in mind, let me share with you another statement of Rav Papa, okay? Now, Rav Papa once tells us the following. You should know, what we're going to have to do here is we're going to have to remember 3 Rav Papa statements. The first one was he was a beer producer. Statement number 2 of Rav Papa is the following. You know, it is never comfortable to be suspected of something that you didn't do, right? It's extremely uncomfortable. No one likes it. No one likes a bad reputation. And obviously, we study the laws of Lashon Hara to be careful not to ever say negative about others. But when someone suspects you, it is painful. How much more so if you know for a fact that you are not to blame for it at all. Now, the rabbis tell us that you should know that if a person is suspected by others, but he is actually fine and kosher, he merits great reward in the world to come. Okay, the rabbis make that statement. Comes Rav Papa, and Rav Papa declares, you should know, Ledidi, I myself, Chashdan, people were suspected, or people suspected me of specific behavior, Velo Havebi, and I was not guilty. Meaning I went through that. I went through that difficulty of people suspecting me, but I'm kosher. So I think I have some credit and reward waiting for me in the world to come. Okay? That's the Rav Papa statement number 2. Keep that in mind. Statement number 3 of Rav Papa, and then we'll have to bring them together. You know, there is a halacha called Bal Tashchit. Bal Tashchit. Not to destroy that which could serve beneficial to humans. Okay, we have sensitivity, especially when it comes to fruit trees, but it is true to anything. Don't destroy things that perhaps could be beneficial for others. And it's a sensitivity that relates often to food, Now, the Talmud shares with us a very interesting story that there were rabbis who believed that Bal Tashchit relates to your financial state as well. In other words, the rabbis tell us if someone could go ahead and eat a food that costs $3 and be satisfied, but instead purchases something that costs $7 and eats it, so basically you are wasting $4, the rabbis label it a Bal Tashchit. This is what we are told. Okay, this is what the rabbis tell us. It is considered a Baal Tashchit. You're wasting money, right? You go ahead and you have 2 supermarkets. And, you know, Jews, sometimes in shul here, I hear conversation, I won't mention names, of people sharing that, you know, that in No Frills, there's a specific deal. You can get grapes for $1.20. That's actually a very Jewish thing to do. You don't want to waste money, right? Give them credit. So if you could go ahead and get great nectarines in Metro and you go to Pusateri's, that is perhaps, and I'm not telling you halachically, this is not the goal, but according to the Talmud, there's a concept of Bal Tashchit. Comes Rav Papa, and Rav Papa tells us you should know, if you have someone that can satisfy himself with shikra, with beer, but instead drinks wine, which is more expensive, so Rav Papa argues that it's a Bal Tashchit. Okay, that's what Rav Papa says. If a person can satisfy himself with beer, now remember, people did not have clean water to drink during a meal. You had a choice, beer or wine. Beer is cheaper, right? Beer is much cheaper even today. If you have the ability to drink beer and you go ahead and choose wine, over mishum Bal Tashchit. This is what Rav Papa tells us in Tractate Shabbat, page 140. The Talmud says at the end it's not true. We don't agree with Rav Papa. Velav miltay, it is not true because since it is better for the body to drink wine, a person should be more sensitive to their body. Bal Tashchit of their guf is more important. In other words, when we talk about not throwing out food, please remember that you shouldn't be throwing out your body. In other words, this is an issue that I wish I would have known this as a kid, when my mother would make me finish what's on the plate, and I would be stuffed. But in the olden days, when kids had to listen, if mom put it on the plate, or if you took it, you better finish it. I should have known this statement at the time, that perhaps you are concerned about not wasting food, but my body is more important. Bal Tashchit of the guf is more important. And therefore, the rabbis disagree with Rav Papa regarding his statement. Okay, but nevertheless, Rav Papa tells us, drink. What should you drink if you have the option of beer versus wine? Drink the beer. That's what Rav Papa says. Now, so remember, we just learned three things in the name of Rav Papa. Number one, he produced beer. Number two, he declared that people were choshed, people were suspected me of something that I was not guilty of. And number three, he says, if you have the ability of drinking beer or wine, choose the beer. Now, with that, there is a great commentator on Talmud, Rabbi Shmuel Eidels. He lived in the 16th into the 17th century. He died in the 1630s. Rabbi Eidels. Rabbi Eidels, could be there's a relationship to the local Eidels in Toronto, wrote on Talmud, not just on halachic matters, but in ashkafic matters as well. It's a classic authority and text to study. In every yeshiva, the words of Rabbi Eidels, the Maharsha, are turned to. Rabbi Eidels tells us the following. Do you want to know why Rav Papa made statement number 3, that a person should drink beer over wine? You want to know why he said that? That is because he was a beer producer. And therefore, he felt that it will be beneficial if people drink beer because that's my product, right? If I am Coca-Cola, obviously I'll tell people that it's much better than Pepsi. And therefore, in the words of the Maharsha, it's a fascinating statement. In the words of Rabbi Eidels, Rav Papa, letovat atzmo amra. He said it for himself. Shehu haya oseh shechar. He was a beer maker. Fine, fascinating it is. A few generations later, a rabbi who read these words was very unhappy with Rabbi Eidels. This rabbi was a rabbi of the 19th century, Rabbi Shmuel Strasson. Some of you have heard perhaps of the Strasson Library in Vilna of his son. Rabbi Shmuel Strasson wrote an Aleph Talmud, and he was a follower of the school of the Vilna Gaon in his way of thinking, but he was very, very unhappy of this statement because he felt it's a disrespect that Rav Papa tells us a halachic statement, really, right? Drink beer over wine, not to do bal tashchit, based on his own interest. He says this is wrong. He says, I disagree completely with what Rabbi Eidels said. And you should know, after reading the words of Rabbi Eidels, I suddenly understand the third statement of Rav Papa. Remember what Rav Papa said? That people were once, right, suspicious, or they once suspected me of something that wasn't true, and I deserve credit for it. So therefore, writes Rabbi Strasson, you know what people suspected Rav Papa? They suspected him that he made this statement that one should drink beer over wine due to his production. Meaning the suggestion made by Rabbi Eidels was a suggestion made many centuries earlier, and Rav Papa addressed such statements. And he said, it's not true. They are suspecting me for something. They are suspecting that the reason I recommend beer over wine is to go ahead and enhance my business. Not so. That's not the case, declares Rav Papa. And therefore, Rabbi Strasson concludes in saying, and therefore the insight to claim that Rav Papa made his statement as Rabbi Eidels is recommending is simply wrong and unacceptable. This is what he tells us. So I think it's an interesting discussion that relates to beer, but I want to walk away with something halachic and practical. And that is, most of the beers you purchase today that are not fancy or enhanced are kosher. They have these Bavarian rules from 1516 that that a beer could only have the water, the hops, and the grain, right? That's it. And today they add yeast, which is kosher as well. On the other hand, over the past few years, there have been many more fancy beers in the marketplace that have additives, all kind of additives and flavors. And those flavors, a person should do a little bit of research before purchasing. So when it comes to the beers you purchase here in Ontario, they have magnificent IPAs and they're popping up everywhere and they do a good job. And obviously you should buy local. The ones that do not have anything but hops, right? The malted grain, the oats, water, yeast, those are going to be and considered kosher. The ones that have additional flavors, or perhaps some of the European ones that are dark, because I once heard that that some of the coloring agents are actually derived from grapes. I don't know if it's a question or not, but the simple beer is good. And our goal is obviously to use these beverages appropriately, to use them in a way that we could appreciate the giver of these beverages, but not, God forbid, become the Noach who is manipulated and controlled by them, as we read in the Parsha. I thank you all for participating in our Words of Torah tonight. It should be a schus on the yahrzeit itself of Yitzchak Elazar ben Mordechai, a person that would bring people together, and yes, at times with a mashke, and that I know. And we should get together. We daven to HaKadosh Baruch Hu that our get-togethers should be one that are face-to-face and in a healthy environment. And we daven for a Yeshua that should come soon. For the time being, keep up the good spirits, even if it's without spirits. Keep up the good work, because everyone is doing good things by taking care of themselves. Take care of your health. Corona is not a joke. We mention it often. And a refuah shalema to those who do need a refuah shalema. I know personally someone that now needs a little bit of a refuah shalema from Corona. You should have a refuah shalema b'karov, and we should hear good news. Thank you again. So I'm going to stop recording.